Alright, I'm going to try to show you all the basic premise using just a couple pieces of fabric. It's simple enough, but when I started out with my raw cut of the shell fabric you saw, the big original squares, and then you attach to them that baffle material, and your question is, how do you sew those strips of the no-seam mesh baffle to the inner and outer shell? Let me start off by saying this is actually a little piece of the black argon, and you'll see that there's a shiny side and a dull side. The shiny side, I believe, is the calendared side. They treat it to where it's downproof. That's the inside. That's where the down will be in contact with, that we'll sew the baffles to. And what you'll do is, what I do anyway, is draw all those lines I was explaining earlier with soap. Or you can use chalk or whatever. Soap works really good though. And draw those lines, and those lines represent where you'll sew on the no-seam mesh. I have some of that mesh material, but I don't have any in strips, so just imagine that now that this is a no-seam baffle. You'll have the lines here pre-made, and you're ready to sew them on. So you take your mesh material like this, and you'll line it up. Let's say that your line's right here. You'll line it up here where you can see it. And I usually use 1/4 of an inch or less as my overlap. And once I have it overlapped, I bring it over to my sewing machine. I line it up with the presser foot, press it down. Now some people might use pins, or I wouldn't. You poke a bunch of holes in your fabric, it's going to be a problem. Plus it's just a pain, and it may be helpful to a degree on certain projects, but it really just will mess you up. I just don't think that pinning it or anything like that will be helpful. I tinkered with the idea at one point of using like some sort of fabric tape. They have this stuff called Wonder Tape that dissolves with like washing later, but it's even to begin to think about doing that, it's very expensive. And in the end, it makes more sense just to manage the fabric as you go with your hands. It's just as easy. So once you get the presser foot down on it and lined up where you're kind of over 1/4 of an inch, like you can see through the mesh and see the white line through the mesh that you made. So you can line it up nicely, put the presser foot down, do your lock stitch, and then once you have it down, for doing the first bit of baffle onto the first layer you do is easy enough. Once you start it, it starts to run. You just have to basically hold it in place, like even just with one hand like this, and just let it kind of feed through, get the next point lined up, hold it there and let it feed through, and that's easy enough actually. Now when you get the second layer, it's the same principle. When you're done with this one, it'll look like this. Let me actually pin it on so I can show you what I'm talking about here. Okay, so once you get it sewn on, you have a free side now. So you have this free side now like this, and then it's the exact same thing that I just did, except you got that other piece of fabric. Let's say that it's this one. This is bad representation, but let's say it's this one, and you want to sew this one onto that one. You just have this free bit here, and it lines up with the new line that you made, just like that. Now it's a little trickier in this case. I like to sew it, and this is just one of these things. I like to sew it with this orientation like this. I bring it right over that line and sew it. Once I get it started, what I do is I reach under the, actually not like this. I reach under to hold this piece. Once I get the first lock stitch made and stuff like this, I reach under to hold this one in place, and then I hold it with this hand, and then it feeds right up through it like that. And I do the same thing again down here like this. And then you'll have several, when you finish your first shell, your first baffles, like you sew all these baffles onto the initial material, you'll have a bunch of those free. And then you just line those up and do this same thing, kind of taking that free end of each of those and sew it to the corresponding correct spot. Obviously, you want to sew them onto the right place. So if you sew them on the wrong lines of the other one that correspond, then you're going to be in trouble. So that's that. It just is a little bit more fabric to manage when you've sewn it onto one, and then to take this new one and sew it onto the new one. But it's tedious a little bit, but it's easy enough. You just have to get the swing of feeling comfortable sewing it without being too nervous. Just make sure before you, what I've done is every time I start a new stitch line, I have just a test piece of fabric and run just 7 or 8 inches of stitch just to kind of check, make sure that my machine is acting good. Mine's been very predictable, but if you got down, if you ever got down through a whole stitch and one's messed up, then you got the seam rip it, and that would be a pain. Another benefit of the bigger stitch, by the way, that's not too tight with the tension, it's easier to rip and do a seam rip. Now I did have to seam rip one whole seam for a project one time, but that's not ideal. So hopefully that helps. If you want me to clarify, I can get some baffle material maybe and kind of do an actual little test thing later if someone is confused. Also, I'll try to put a link to a YouTube video that shows it. I think there's one out there or two that show the actual sewing of the baffle material on. Hope that helps. Bye-bye.